Good morning. Ayn Rand's ethics not only tells you that you should be selfish, it tells you how to be. Man needs a code to guide him, and in identifying the 7 major virtues, Ayn Rand indicates the fundamentals of that moral code. Step back from her ethics for a moment, though. What the philosophy is all about, objectivism in general, is you being happy. You having the best life you can. You need to know the kind of world you live in, how you can acquire knowledge of it, the issues of metaphysics, epistemology, and the essentials of the other branches of philosophy in order to achieve your happiness. But that's what philosophy is for. That's what your understanding of objectivism is for. Clearly then, since Ayn Rand's account of the virtues is objectivism's most direct instruction for how to lead your life, the more fully you understand each virtue, the stronger position you'll be in to exercise the virtue and reap its rewards. Why independence, then, for us this morning? I think we all know from personal experience that certain of the virtues come more naturally to us than others, us individually, right? Whether we're talking about your intellectual understanding of a given virtue or your ease in practicing it. Wherever independence happens to fall for you personally on this spectrum, what makes independence worth special attention for all of us, I think, is the fact that we live in a culture that is adamantly antagonistic to it. Whereas nearly everyone applauds honesty and justice and integrity, other of the objectivist virtues, albeit with some alien ideas of what these are and of why they are virtues, independence is generally viewed as toxic. No man is an island. Maybe independence had some value in its day, but today more than ever we are all interdependent. When you go to school, you're socialized. You don't learn how to read and write anymore, witness the graduates. You do learn how to play well with others, to be a contributor to the community, to recycle bottles and become a vegetarian for the good of the global community. At the office, the premium is on being a team player, someone who won't disagree, ask too many questions, make trouble, being someone who'll put the good of the group first. Arts and entertainment offer very little these days that's truly new and original. In theater, we see an endless cycle of revivals and adaptations of works that have succeeded at the box office in movies and television, right? We see the Disneyfication of Broadway. And in those arenas, television, movies, we see a dizzying array of spin-offs of Law and Order, which I like. I like the basic Law and Order, no problem, okay? You like a reality show? Okay, here are 17, right? The political realm, and this one is old hat by now. It's tiresome to recite, but nonetheless I will, right? How the political realm is driven by polls. Our alleged leaders breathlessly pander to whatever the masses tell them they want. Religions, obviously, have long preached obedience. Islam, as we've all learned in recent years, means, the very word means, submission. Christ exhorted us to self-abnegation in a variety of forms. Giving away your money, turning the other cheek, humility, being meek and poor in spirit, those are the blessed, right? Well, believers should be pleased, for we have all, religious and non-religious alike, become adept at obeying these commands. We are continually chided in any controversy to see the issue from the other guy's point of view, walk a mile in his shoes. The fact is, you are so inundated with what everyone else wants, the real challenge today is to hear yourself. In this climate, it is especially valuable to understand the virtue of independence, to try to fully mine its value in our exercise of it. So this morning I will proceed in 3 phases, examining, and this is on the handout, examining exactly what independence is, the value of independence, why it is a virtue, and what it demands in practice. So, 1, what independence is. In her essay, The Objectivist Ethics, Ayn Rand characterizes independence as, and this is A on your handout, quote, one's acceptance of the responsibility of forming one's own judgments and of living by the work of one's own mind, close quote. Independence is a matter of making one's own way in the world. The independent person supports himself both intellectually and materially, thinking for himself and taking productive action to sustain himself. What enables a person to make his own way is indicated in Ayn Rand's description of that exemplar of independence, Howard Rourke, who faces life, quote, as if he were the first man born. Nothing stands between the evidence of his senses and the conclusions his mind draws from them, close quote. In Opar, accordingly, Dr. Peikoff describes independence as a primary orientation to reality rather than to other men. And I think he chose that term very deliberately, for as orientation suggests, independence concerns a person's most basic framework for leading his life. Whether a person is independent turns on where he looks, fundamentally, for guidance to steer his course. What does he regard as his basic source of knowledge? Where does he turn to discover the kind of world he lives in, the kinds of values he must achieve, and the kinds of actions he must take to achieve those values? What does he regard as his highest authority? The independent person, Dr. Peikoff explains, recognizes the difference between the metaphysical and the man-made. He accepts the primacy of existence. Now, that may sound a bit abstract for a discussion of independence, but the idea is simply that in every issue that a person encounters, he can distinguish between what people say about the issue and what reality says, what actually is so. It can be tempting to treat others' views as gospel, given the number of people who share certain views and the apparent strength of their convictions. The independent person resists that temptation. He recognizes that other people's beliefs do not mold reality any more than his own beliefs do. This is not to say that the independent person should eschew other people. He can enjoy such interpersonal values as trade, education, friendship. Other people are not, however, to quote Dr. Peikoff, his motor, his sustainer, or his purpose, close quote. They are not what gets him going, what keeps him going, or the reason why he goes to a particular destination. The independent person charts his course by his own judgment of reality. Now, our understanding of independence is sharpened considerably by Ayn Rand's portrait of the alternative, second-handedness. A second-hander, quote, is one who regards the consciousness of other men as superior to his own and to the facts of reality, close quote. The second-hander turns to others as his fundamental frame of reference. He treats other people as his ultimate ruler rather than his own first-hand grasp of reality. Other people are reality in his mind. Probably the most vivid image most objectivists have of a second-hander is of Peter Keating. In her journals, Ayn Rand describes his basic MO, and this is B on your handout. To Keating, all reality is second-hand, through others, by others, for others. His life is an eternal concern with what others will think, what others will say, how others will react to him. Keating's spirit is an empty space which other men have to fill. His consuming ambition is to be great in other people's eyes. Thus, at the root of his spirit, others take precedence over his own self. Others establish all his values. Others become the motive power of his will to live. Keating's apparent pursuit of his self-interest is truly all about others. It's important to recognize, however, that Keating represents just one species of second-hander. A thief who expropriates others' property by force, or a moocher who obtains property by preying on others' sympathy, is clearly dependent on his victims for the goods he takes from them. Rather than work to earn the values he seeks, he relies on others to supply them. A power luster, be it a bully, a dictator, or a newspaper tycoon, is a second-hander as well, as he depends on bossing other people around in order to feel whole or successful. He regards the manipulation of others as his source of value. What Gail Winand, a successful power luster by many measures, realizes in the end is that, quote, a leash is only a rope with a noose at both ends, close quote. Domination of others, in other words, is not the path to happiness. Yet another type of second-hander is the altruist, insofar as the charter for his actions is entirely determined by the needs of others. His role in life is simply to serve others' welfare. Ayn Rand describes such a person as a parasite in motive, who hitches his course to theirs. Still another second-hander, the person who proceeds by faith rather than reason. To accept a belief on faith is to accept it in the absence of, or contrary to, evidence or proof. Doing this precludes the possibility of independence, since a person cannot think for himself if he refuses to think at all. He cannot be oriented to reality if he ignores the evidence of reality. The more one thinks about it, the more one realizes that even our vocabulary attests to numerous species of second-handedness. Freeloader, sponge, leech, bootlicker, brown-noser, toady, chameleon, sycophant. Now, while it's convenient to be able to label people, what's less conspicuous, but probably far more common and just as parasitic, are countless people who seem independent insofar as they hold jobs and pay their bills, but who surrender their souls by unreflectively deferring to the standards of others. They are driven by a need to fit in or to be well thought of. This thirst for the affirmation of others can affect the jobs people take, the groups they join, the relationships that they form, the goals they adopt. While the independent person will choose his career, for instance, by the relevant facts of reality, his enjoyment of the work, his aptitude for it, his judgment of its value, employment prospects. The second-hander will choose his career by reference to what other people think of it, becoming a physician, for instance, because everybody's impressed by doctors, or going into a helping profession because society considers it noble. While the independent person adopts his political affiliations by reference to relevant reality, parties' track records, his own assessment of the causes of social problems and the likely effects of proposed solutions, the second-hander adopts the position that is most favored among his neighbors or friends or colleagues without bothering to examine whether that position is justified. All of these many forms of second-handedness share its essence. Whether the second-hander seeks material or spiritual values, property he has not earned, or esteem he has not earned, or direction whose validity he does not understand. Whether more broadly he seeks others' approval for all he does, or conformity with prevailing opinion for all he knows, the second-hander rejects reality and substitutes other people as his ultimate sovereign. To quote the fountainhead, the independent man's concern is the conquest of nature. The parasite's concern is the conquest of men. Now, it is not that all second-handers consciously decide, I care more about other people than about reality. What often tends to happen, I think, is that a person gradually loses a sharp sense of the difference. Extrapersonal reality fades from his conceptual inventory. The stronger a person's orientation to other people grows, the more that other people's opinions will seem all-important, and the weaker the person's appreciation of the primacy of existence. An example. When an objectivist first reads Dr. Peikoff's account of independence in OPAR, I think it can seem a bit jarring, not quite what he expected. Because independence, after all, is a social virtue, social insofar as it concerns relations among people. What's orientation to reality doing here so prominently? If you had a twinge of that reaction when you first read Opar, and I certainly did. I probably still had it on a second reading, maybe even a third. I can't recall. If you had a twinge of that reaction, I think it's a reflection of the extent to which our conception of moral phenomena, our conceptions of moral phenomena have been infected by the prevalent assumption that morality is social through and through. It is all about dealing with people, such that if independence means not going by others, it must mean instead going by oneself, directing one's life by one's own ideas. Now, while there certainly is truth in this, it's not the whole story and it's not the fundamental. The independent person, as Dr. Peikoff stresses, approaches his days objectively. He does not allow the content of others' consciousnesses to obstruct his reliance on reality as the basis for conducting his life. But what's especially important here is, nor does he follow his own thoughts or feelings without ensuring their validity. Obviously, a person can learn a great deal from others, and his own feelings are relevant to many decisions, choice of career, choice of spouse, and so on. But the point is that the independent person uses his consciousness to apprehend reality. He does not allow the content of anyone's consciousness, others or his own, simply because they are what somebody thinks, to substitute for reality. Correspondingly, it's important to appreciate that independence is not subjectivism, the view that any of a person's beliefs or desires or actions is valid so long as it is his. Independence is not whim worship. Because independence is an orientation to reality, it requires rational judgment. The call for independence is not licensed to indulge any urges that a person happens to experience. As Ayn Rand explains, and this is C on the handout, quote, one's own independent judgment is the means by which one must choose one's actions, but it is not a moral criterion, nor a moral validation, close quote. The fact that a person's conclusion is his own does not ensure that it is correct. The person pursuing his objective self-interest, his happiness, must be concerned with getting his judgments right. I'll say a little bit more about subjectivism later. I'm aware as I say that I'm sure for many of you that isn't a temptation or a worry, but there still is lingering confusion about that sometimes, so I do want to come back to that a little bit further. Ayn Rand distills the essence of independence in Rourke's reference to men of unborrowed vision. An independent man looks for himself, sees for himself, and thinks and acts on that basis. Moreover, to alter the sensory metaphors, he does not listen for the echo. When he acts, he is not concerned in any fundamental way with how his action will seem to others. Reality is his guide from start to finish. In the end, then, independence is an issue of method, the fundamental method by which a person runs his life. To answer questions and make decisions, does he direct his focus to what other people think about reality or to reality itself? An independent person seeks neither his direction, his conclusions, nor his satisfactions from others. Others are not his compass. Reality is. If we now have a better understanding, better grasp of what independence is, we can turn to the second question. What is its value? Why is it a virtue? In a nutshell, because reason is man's means of survival, of creating the values that sustain us. Since the requirements of our survival are not found ready-made in nature, a person faces a choice, whether to survive by, quote, the work of his own mind, or as a parasite fed by the minds of others, close quote. In identifying independence as a virtue, Ayn Rand is recognizing the strong pull that other people often exert on a person and signaling the kind of disciplined focus on reality that human life requires. In Galt's speech, she writes, D on your handout, quote, "Independence is the recognition of the fact that yours is the responsibility of judgment, and nothing can help you escape it, that no substitute can do your thinking, as no pinch hitter can live your life," close quote. Other people's judgments are fallible, as a person's own are. More importantly, even when others' judgments are correct, they do not supersede reality. That remains the inexorable master that a person must satisfy. A person's success ultimately depends on his effectively navigating the world as it is, not other people's beliefs about the way the world is. Thus, it makes no sense to treat others' opinions as a higher authority than one's own grasp of facts. The orientation around reality is imperative. And parenthetically, I have a somewhat like-minded quote from Frederick Douglass, about whom I know some of you have heard this week in a lecture by Debbie Gatte. So if you're interested, you can ask in the Q&A. It's a brief quotation. Close parentheses, okay. The case for independence, then, is a direct outgrowth of the case for rationality. While man cannot survive except through his mind, to quote the fountainhead, the mind is an attribute of the individual. There is no such thing as a collective brain or a collective thought. Even an agreement among several individuals is simply a convergence of the thinking performed by each. Because reason is volitional, it is inherently self-directed, which means that the need for independence is implicit in the need for rationality. A person can only engage in rational thought for himself. Others cannot operate a person's reason on his behalf. One might put a gun to his head to try to get him to think, but the decision to do so is inescapably his. No one else can think for a person. Nor can a person reach rational conclusions or acquire knowledge without thinking for himself. Consider the familiar experience of listening to another person explain a difficult point. Explain that point a few times, maybe 2 or 3 or 4, and finally at some stage realizing, now I get it. Prior to that, while you might have said that you understood, that would not have been true. The breakthrough occurs due to your own apprehension of the relevant material. It is only through first-handed engagement with the material that you can come to authentically understand it. While a person can learn from others, to accept another person's conclusions without thinking them through for himself is to regress to the performance of a parrot. The result of such an exercise is not knowledge. The ability to recite particular words does not bespeak genuine learning, as encounters with parrots make plain. As John Locke, the philosopher John Locke, observed, and this is on your handout, E, we may as rationally hope to see with other men's eyes as to know by other men's understandings. The floating of other men's opinions in our brains makes us not one jot the more knowing, even if they happen to be true. In a similar vein, Ayn Rand writes, E, no matter how vast your knowledge or how modest, it is your own mind that has to acquire it. Your mind is your only judge of truth. And if others dissent from your verdict, reality is the court of final appeal. Nothing but a man's mind can perform that complex, delicate, crucial process of identification, which is thinking. Nothing can direct the process but his own judgment. Dr. Peikoff spells this out still further. G. A man cannot think if he places something, anything, above his perception of reality. He cannot follow the evidence unswervingly or uphold his conclusions intransigently while regarding compliance with other men as his moral imperative. The point. Independence is a precondition of rational judgment. To the extent that any thought process is dependent, treating other people as its touchstone, it is not rational. And because independence is vital to rationality, independence is vital to life. Human life depends on rational thought and action. Regardless of whether a person is exists on a desert island or in a society with millions, the wellspring of values, what allows a person to create those things that will advance his life, is a mind's grasp of reality. We live on independent thinking, quite literally. Consider some things that are objective values in many people's lives. Aspirin, cell phones, eBay. What makes these things valuable? The fact that they stand in a life-furthering relationship to the individual in question. Whether a thing does stand in that relationship, however, depends on what it is, as opposed to what some people think it is. People might wish for the convenience of portable telephones, but whether a given device can provide that service depends on its material construction, its circuitry, its ability to conduct a satellite signal, and so on, right? People might like to have a pill that can relieve pain, but whether a given pill does that depends on its ingredients, the chemistry of the human body. Rain dances do not coax crops from the ground. Consciousness does not dictate reality. Accordingly, it does not dictate the conditions of human existence or the terms of value. This principle is equally true in those cases in which other people's attitudes can affect a thing's value. If eBay is of value to you, it is so because it allows you to trade goods at attractive prices and maybe offers certain other conveniences. Now, obviously, the popularity of eBay can affect its utility, right? The more people who use it, the better the chances of finding certain deals. And also, the harder to find others because other people, more other people out there, greater the chances you'll be outbid, I guess, for what you're going for, right? The point, however, is eBay is of value to some people because of the service it provides, not simply because other people like it. Same holds for any objective value. For to create the values that fuel our lives, human beings must navigate reality rather than some people's images of reality. Nothing that is not grounded on the facts of our needs and on the actual means of fulfilling those needs can enhance a person's life. Playing make-believe cannot sustain human life, however many play along. Look at the standard of living in societies that have tried. Substituting other people as one's fundamental guide amounts to such a fruitless game. The second-hander fails to respect this. He acts on the basis of what others would say or do. He chooses clothes or car or career entirely by his projections of what others would expect or want or admire. He ignores what should guide his thoughts and actions, facts such as his own budget or abilities or enjoyment, and erects in their place a new master. His policy is doomed, however. By abdicating the judgment of his own mind, the second-hander relinquishes the very tool that is crucial for human life. By orienting himself to other people, the second-hander leaves himself at the mercy of whomever he happens to follow. It is for this reason that Galt describes dependence as a course of self-abasement and self-destruction. The independent person recognizes that his judgment is what counts, because that is his indispensable means of achieving values. Other people may be smarter than he, but he cannot know whether their ideas are of any value to him unless he assesses them for himself. Being independent cannot guarantee that a person will invariably reach correct conclusions. Yet, as Ayn Rand observes, and this is quotation H, quote, "An error made on your own is safer than 10 truths accepted on faith, because the first leaves you the means to correct it, but the second destroys your capacity to distinguish truth from error." Close quote. In essence, since the only path to rational action is through independence, and since human beings rely on rational action to survive, independence is critical to our lives. This is its value and why it is a virtue. Nonetheless, we should notice a further significant truth before leaving this segment. The independent man is the only true egoist. I discuss the relationship between independence and egoism at much greater length in an essay in the forthcoming Fountainhead collection, which Dr. Mayu has edited, which I think is coming out in December, just in time for Christmas, I hope. So I can't go into it in depth here, but let me make that claim again and explain a little bit. The independent man is the only true egoist. Since the mind is responsible for everything that distinguishes an individual, his thoughts, his actions, his character, even to some extent the condition of his body, it is a person's mind more than anything else that is his self. By subordinating his mind's grasp of reality to the judgment of others, however, the second-hander places others above himself in the deepest sense possible. Now notice here, second-handedness may not be intended as a sacrifice of oneself. On the contrary, a second-hander often believes that he is advancing his interest by pursuing a certain relationship to others. Most of the schmoozers, bullies, and other second-handers we've mentioned are, by conventional standards, paradigms of selfishness. They seek to prey on others in various ways and to gratify their own desires. This interpretation is superficial, however. For whatever form of second-handedness a person practices, whether he seeks to serve others, to exploit others, or to erase his own thoughts and simply follow others, others dominate his landscape. The second-hander does not embrace ends based on his appraisal of their merit, but as a reaction to others. He attends a party because a certain group considers it the place to be Saturday night. He supports a candidate because his colleagues expect it. He attempts to dominate co-workers because success is measured by who's on top. The point is, even a person who succeeds in satisfying his desires to rule others, to dupe others, to be admired by others, when those desires are dictated by his relation to others, does not genuinely advance his self. Man's self is his consciousness. Dr. Peikoff, by the way, has a good discussion of this in the introductory essay to the 50th anniversary edition of Anthem. So you see, if you don't have that edition, you have another reason to go to the bookstore, okay? Man's self is his consciousness. Because the second-hander is preoccupied with other people, however, his thoughts, feelings, and desires are buried. Indeed, the more regularly a person defers to others, the more inclined he will be to do so in the future, and the less likely he will be to even form opinions or ends of his own to bury. Why bother cultivating his own convictions, his subconscious learns, if they will be set aside as soon as they interfere with his occupying the right position in relation to others? The sense in which the second-hander's life is his is steadily eroded, his very identity gradually extinguished. Because he is defined by his position vis-à-vis others, he forfeits a genuine self whose interest he could serve. The dependent person can be described more accurately as a shell filled with others' prescriptions. Whatever his avowed intentions, the person who allows others to chart his course abnegates himself as much as the most deliberately committed altruist, for he renounces those elements that constitute his self. This is eloquently depicted in the deterioration of Keating over the course of the Fountainhead. By the story's end, he is not a person. The thing that occupies his body and answers to his name is merely a conglomeration of the ideas, attitudes, and wishes of other people. All the people he sought to imitate and impress over the years. Let me also note a non-fiction example. According to one recent observer of Islam, the most common expression uttered by Muslims is, "If Allah wills it." This credo and the attendant passivity it breeds are particularly strong among Muslim women who are trained to be submissive not only to Allah but to men. Consequently, the observer reports, Muslim women who are victims of physical abuse, beatings, rape, frequently cite the Quran to justify the men's violence against them, often voluntarily returning to their husbands when the husbands are the culprits here, promising to be better and more obedient. This is submission in practice. The observer here, by the way, is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the Somalian-born woman I'm sure many of you have heard about. Somalian-born, raised in Islam, who served in the Dutch parliament for a while until essentially being ousted just several weeks ago in a big brouhaha in the Netherlands about immigration laws. As she, Ali, astutely observes elsewhere, such submission, not only this of women to men, but such submission as Islam encourages, is self-betrayal. So to bring this part to a close, egoism counsels the pursuit of self-interest. A person cannot serve himself unless he has a self, however. And it is the exercise of independence that enables a person to be a self, to be an individual possessing thoughts and ends of his own. Thus, independence serves the self not only in the way that all the virtues do, all rational virtues, by fostering the achievement of the values that life requires. It also helps a person to build a genuine self for whom anything could be objectively valuable. So then, how to be an independent person? We come to part 3. How does one exercise this virtue? What are its practical demands? Independence, again, is acceptance of the responsibility of forming one's own judgments and of living by one's own mind. As such, its demands are straightforward. To begin with the intellectual level, independence demands that a person think for himself. In contrast to the person who passively falls into line behind others, unreflectively accepting their opinions as best, the independent person subjects beliefs and practices to his own first-hand scrutiny. He checks ideas against reality as far as he is able. He examines evidence, questions claims, draws inferences, and adopts ends on the basis of his grasp of the relevant facts, rather than by substituting the thoughts or precedents of others. Independence imposes no prohibition on consulting or learning from others, but it does rule out subjugation of one's own judgment to that of others simply because it is others. At bottom, the issue is whether one proceeds by reason or faith. An independent person does not relinquish the reins of his life to any social authority, religious or secular, singular or plural. While others might correct an error he has made, independence demands that he understands that correction for himself. Ayn Rand put it starkly, and this is I on your handout. The independent man, quote, must examine a theory presented to him by other men exactly as he examines any fact of physical nature, by the same method, through the same act of independent rational judgment. He is as alone in the presence of an idea as in the presence of a jungle. Close quote. For an illustration of what she has in mind, consider a few passages from Atlas. These are not on your handout, and they're fairly extensive. While Dagny is weighing whether to join the strike, Hugh Axton explains, quote, "It is not your obedience that we seek to win, but your rational conviction. You have seen all the elements of our secret. The conclusion is now yours to draw. We can help you to name it, but not to accept it. The sight, the knowledge, and the acceptance must be yours." Close quote. A little later, when Dagny is on the brink of making her decision, Axton advises, quote, "Consider the reasons which make us certain that we are right, but not the fact that we are certain. If you are not convinced, ignore our certainty. Don't be tempted to substitute our judgments for your own." Close quote. Note, too, that the first rule of the strikers' community is that one must always see for oneself. So, so much for those who say that Ayn Rand just wanted mindless disciples who would treat her every word as, infallible dogma. And I thought it was striking yesterday that in Dr. Milgram's presentation, from early on, there were several, I counted at least 4 or 5, very direct references in Ayn Rand's thinking and intent in her public speaking to encourage people to think for themselves, to be independent. Now, given the prevalence of subjectivist notions of independence, it is important to emphasize that the basis for the independent person's conclusions is reason rather than feeling. A person's interest is not advanced through the satisfaction of irrational desires, however strongly felt as his such desires may be. Independence does not consist in indulging whatever inclinations an individual happens to experience. It is not whatever I want that rules an independent man, but whatever, in fact, will objectively serve my life. In this vein, consider Ayn Rand's response to a question contending that Nietzsche was an individualist. And this is contained in the Ayn Rand Answers book, which is a treasure trove of valuable Ayn Rand. Question period. Her answer to this question about Nietzsche as an individualist. Quote, "There is no greater contradiction than a subjectivist calling himself an individualist. An individualist is essentially a man who thinks independently. A subjectivist is a man who does not care to think, who wants to be guided by feelings and instincts. To survive, such a man must be a parasite on the thinking of others. An individualist parasite is a contradiction in terms." Close quote. It's just, she just tossed that off the top of her head in a question period. Along similar lines, independence does not require that a person strive to be different. The Emersonian ideal of nonconformity, whoso would be a man would be a nonconformist, corsets a person to other people, instructing him to diverge from the path of others rather than to follow it. As such, it is simply another form of having others call the tune, and I'm sure many of you have realized that. It's okay to sometimes say, "Me too," right? What matters is the means by which a person reaches his conclusion rather than whether his conclusion happens to be shared by others or whether they got there first, they realized it first, they figured it out first. Okay. Another requirement, we're still talking about the practical requirements of being independent. While we saw a little while ago that independence enables an individual to be a self, independence simultaneously demands a commitment to oneself. When the second-hander's own thoughts diverge from others, he shrugs off his thoughts. Well, it's good enough for them. Why are others' views considered more compelling than his own? The less a person thinks of himself, the easier it is to answer this question. The person of low self-regard will think, what do I know? How important are my desires? In order to resist such inclinations to defer to others and to follow through on his own judgment, a person must value himself. The exercise of independence, in other words, requires a quotient of self-esteem that enables a person to view his judgment as capable and his ends as worthy. Independence will be impossible for anyone who lacks a commitment to his own value. Now, for thinking about our own practice of independence even more directly, notice that the terms I have used throughout, second-hander, and a few times parasite, these terms connote the most extreme alternatives to independence, right? Plagiarists, pirates, spineless yes-men, fawning sycophants. I mean, maybe you didn't have pirates in mind, but To guard against lapsing into second-handedness, we need to bear in mind that it can also assume many more moderate forms. The person who adjusts what he says to offer people what he thinks they want to hear. The person whose opinions are absorbed uncritically from the editorial pages or his minister or Ayn Rand or ARI op-eds. Uncritically, right? The academic who concludes that if an author was published in this journal, he must be a first-rate intellect. The person who is ruled by thoughts of what he is supposed to do, what is expected here, what would others think. The status seeker, the name dropper, even the occasional name dropper, all fail to exercise independence insofar as their course is determined by other people. Individuals can practice second-handedness in different spheres and to different degrees. A given individual might be obsequious towards certain people but not others. Or he might be status-driven in regard to his professional standing but not his personal possessions. Whatever the form and whatever the degree, Since these less extreme forms are more tempting to most of us, it's important to realize that these too are inconsistent with being independent. When we inquire about the material demands of independence, we find that they have been implicit in much of our discussion already. It is important for a person to think for himself in order for him to attain knowledge. Knowledge is not an end in itself, however. It is valuable for guiding one's actions. Correspondingly, independence is not complete unless a person follows through and acts on his first-hand judgment. If a human being wishes to live, he must enact the causes necessary to achieve that effect. The second-hander seeks the effects of life-sustaining action without enacting the requisite cause. He intends to leave it to others to think and work, hoping simply to cash in on the fruits of their labor. The independent person, in contrast, pays his own way. He accepts responsibility for his own well-being and invests the appropriate effort to achieve it. The independent person lives by the work of his own mind, using his judgment and action to achieve the values that his life requires. Rather than relying on others to meet his needs, whether by begging or burgling or some subtle hybrid of such methods, he exerts his own productive effort. Now, this virtue does not prescribe the concretes by which each individual should do this. It does not even demand that every able-bodied adult hold a job, for instance, or that he spurn assistance from others, assistance volunteered by others. If a person's spouse is able and willing to support him, independence does not demand that the person refuse. For one person might gain spiritual value from another person's devoting his time to unremunerative activities, such as fiction writing or raising the children. Receiving financial support that liberates you from the need to earn a paycheck does not necessarily compromise your independence. As long as you conscientiously fulfill your part of the bargain, you're engaging in an honorable trade of spiritual for material goods. Both parties are the beneficiaries. Accepting others' assistance need not mean reorienting your basic method of guiding your life. It does not entail treating a benefactor as the maestro who conducts your course. In any relationship, the requirement of first-handed assessment of relevant facts about the other person and about that person's potential value to you remains. Now, to this point, I have differentiated the material and intellectual demands of independence. Ultimately, though, these stand or fall together. This is a little bit tricky, so I'll go a little bit slowly here. Because rationality is the root of life-sustaining action, material independence relies on intellectual independence. Human beings can only produce the material values necessary to fuel their existence through reality-focused rather than people-focused thought. Pleasing my neighbors or satisfying the FDA cannot coax coats from the clouds or medicine from the trees. Consequently, the person who does not engage in such reality-focused thought, but is intellectually dependent, will become materially independent. If he is not generating value-producing ideas, he must rely on others who are, for the material values that he needs in order to live. By the same token, a person who is materially dependent on others must become intellectually dependent, insofar as he will need to maintain the good graces of those on whom his material well-being depends. He will need to appease those people, family members, business associates, bureaucrats, whoever, by saying what they wish to hear and acting in ways they smile upon in order to continue the stream of benefits. Thus, the two facets of independence are mutually reinforcing. Intellectual independence allows for material independence and requires material independence, just as material independence allows for and requires intellectual independence. The core of the practical demands of independence then are, I think, as I said, straightforward. It is natural, though, to have questions about implications for proper relations with others, since we deal with other people in a myriad of ways every day. right? We've been dealing with each other all week. I hope it's gone well. As for me, but. Now here I have time only to comment really on a couple of issues. The relentless contention of our interdependence, and the typical admonishment that any praise of independence be corrected with the reminder that man is a social animal. Is he? Depends on what you mean by that. The claim is ambiguous. Is the claim that a human being enjoys associating with others? That he benefits from others? That he cannot survive without others? A very strong but strict and seemingly literal understanding of dependence, right? Cannot survive without others? Is the idea that his character is formed by others? Ayn Rand's own remarks on this, if read out of context, can be confusing. For in different places, she says that man is and isn't a social animal. I give several of these in the book. I don't have time to go into all of them here. But a sampler, in Atlas, Axton affirms that, quote, man is a social being, but not in the way that the looters preach, close quote. Clearly, we are not dependent on others, in that strong sense, cannot survive without. For all that others might and do offer, all that any given others might offer a person, other people are not human beings' most basic source of sustenance. Reliance on the beliefs or desires or charity of others is not the root to human life. Nor are we social in the sense that our characters are shaped by others. In an oral question period, Ayn Rand observes that while living in a rational society can help a man's development, and living in an irrational society can make it more difficult, in some cases much more difficult. Society cannot make or unmake a man. Quote, society cannot form a person. It cannot force him to accept ideas, close quote. And you might think there about Exhibit A, the speaker responding to that question, Ayn Rand, who grew up in the Soviet Union, okay. Elsewhere, she rejects the image of man as either a social animal or a lone wolf. What he is, she says, is a contractual animal. What is certainly true is that human beings, when living properly, tend both to enjoy and benefit from one another. This is the thrust of Axton's remark. Those who live as rational egoists and among rational egoists enjoy pleasant and mutually beneficial relationships. In terms of independence, however, even if a person is more likely to lead a flourishing, happy life if he establishes certain relationships with others, this does not mean that his life would be enhanced by contact with any other person. Whatever values a person might gain from others are not to be had equally from all others, interchangeably. Other people are not valuable to a person simply in virtue of being others. Whether a particular individual is valuable to you depends on the specific relationship in which he stands to your life. What is critical is that in order for you to select the others whose association would truly be valuable to you, you must exercise first-handed judgment of reality. You must weigh the qualities you observe in this person, as well as your own ends, abilities, needs, tastes, and so on. Even the great value that other individuals can offer, in other words, cannot be acquired without your independence. What about the popular refrain that in the contemporary world we are all interdependent? Dr. Peikoff has offered the key to unlock this one. It rests on a failure to distinguish beneficial relationships from dependent relationships. A person can gain a great deal from interactions with others without abandoning his fundamental orientation around reality. The price of benefits from the butcher, the teacher, the doctor, the friend is not your policy of judging for yourself. Rourke acknowledges needing people to give him work. He is not building mausoleums, he says. Winning clients, however, does not entail sacrificing his judgment to theirs. part of the reason this interdependence claim gains currency is the fact that people have more values to offer one another today, and it is generally easier to acquire those values. These facts do not alter the fundamental requirements of human survival, however. A person's failure to achieve his ends through his preferred means, no one wants to sell me at the price I want to pay, does not leave him less able to meet his needs or more dependent on others than he was in the past. He might be dependent on others in order to satisfy a particular preference, but the possibility of satisfying such a preference, the possibility, would not have even arisen without the relevant activities of others. I can have a chance of gratifying a preference for a car with heated seats, for instance, or for wireless internet access, only because other people have come up with such things. Yeah, other people, but their creating these improvements is a good thing, an enhancement of life. Having a greater pool of potential values to enjoy thanks to the efforts of others does not weaken a person's grip on his life or weaken his ability to sustain himself. Nor would adopting the people-riveted posture of a second-hander improve his well-being. Increased cooperative interactions with others do not obviate human beings' need for first-handed judgment. While many forms of cooperation can be tremendously beneficial to a person, they are so to the extent that they are governed by the participant's first-handed judgment. I hope it's clear, then, that the requirement that a person make his own way does not entail that the independent person should be indifferent to others or hostile to others. It does not demand that a person refuse to listen to others' opinions or never change his mind. For example, if a manager implementing new policies encounters employee resistance, independence permits his taking their views into account. Indeed, rationality requires that he consider the grounds of their resistance to determine its validity. If, after doing this, he concludes that his policy changes should be made, he should implement them in a way most likely to be effective, which might involve adjusting their precise implementation in order to address some of their concerns. What an independent person cannot do is abandon the changes that he deems appropriate simply on the grounds that others dislike them. Embracing the virtue of independence does not deny the tremendous value that a person can gain from other people. It is rational for an egoist to take advantage of the knowledge of experts, the advice of the more experienced, the goods and services that others have created. Independence does not require that a person reinvent every wheel for himself. Independence is not an end in itself. It is a means to happiness. To conclude, I want to shift gears. This week, shifting gears rather dramatically here, this week America has been celebrating its independence. That 1776 declaration was not primarily against, however, a negation. The casting off of British oppression would not be something for us to still be celebrating today with parades and fireworks, were it not for the fact that the founders accepted the responsibility of making their own way in the world and established a society, a political system that leaves individuals free to lead independent lives. Those of us convened here this week have occasion to celebrate another achievement of independence, an even deeper one, that is not simply political but philosophical. Ayn Rand's identification of the necessity of personal independence. Because human life depends on rationality, and because rationality is inherently a do-it-yourself enterprise, anchored in an orientation to reality, independence is vital to human life. So in closing, I suggest we pay tribute to the most fiercely independent character we meet in Ayn Rand's fiction, the figure of uniquely unborrowed vision. Alice Rosenbaum, the girl reading the newspapers who we heard about yesterday, the woman who made herself Ayn Rand. And I suggest that the greatest tribute each of us can pay is by practicing her philosophy, by exercising this virtue, by being independent, first-handers. In terms of her reader response, I suspect nothing would have made Ayn Rand happier. And I know, this much I know, no alternative could make you happier. Thank you. So we have lots of time for questions, if there are any.
What was the quote from Frederick Douglass that you were going to mention?
And I should say this quotation is from a lecture he delivered called Self-Made Men. It's a lecture he delivered 50-odd times. Okay, so that's the context. And in talking about self-made men, he makes the following point, quote, "Men may cheat their neighbors and may cheat themselves, but they cannot cheat nature. She will only pay the wages one honestly earns." Close quote. That's pretty good, you know? I mean, cannot cheat nature, cannot cheat reality, and that's part of making the case for being self-made. So I'm sure, I don't know much about Frederick Douglass. Perhaps Debbie Gatte could fill one in more on that if she's familiar with that particular talk, or if that's a motif in other of his writing. I really don't know. Yes?
One of the things you said was, others are not his compass, reality is. And I was wondering if you would tell me if that is a bit of a metaphor, because reality is actually the realm in which you need a compass to get around it.
Yes? and you recognize, yeah, it's reality I have to go by.
Yeah.
So I'm using the compass of reality. I mean, obviously, there are derivative compasses we use. Reason, right? Logic, right? More particular moral principles. These are obviously the derivative, more specific and more helpful, because it's very abstract to speak of reality. And it's pretty abstract to speak of rationality, which is why Ayn Rand goes on to tell us, fleshing out, there's one virtue, rationality. But she realized, given the kinds of issues that we repeatedly encounter, it's really helpful to break that into honesty and integrity and productiveness and justice and so on, right? So you're certainly right that we need other compasses, okay? But they are all ways of being rational, which is being anchored in and reality and realizing there ain't no cheating reality. Okay. Yes?
My question is about the process of learning from others, and there's a dependent method of functioning which basically involves substituting a book or a lecture for one's own judgment. But there's also an independent method which involves using it as a guide or as an aid for what's basically one's own thinking. And my question is whether it's ever legitimately a concern to excessively rely on others for learning, even if one's trying to basically use one's own judgment?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Even if one's trying basically to use a book or a lecture as an aid or as a guide, is it ever concerned to excessively rely?
Well, okay. Perfectly reasonable question. It's certainly a concern. That is, in anything you do, there's a danger of not being first-handed, of not thinking things through for yourself. And there's probably a particular danger when you are going to others for some guidance, for some knowledge, right? There is that danger of substituting what they say for what you understand and think. It's okay to go to experts sometimes, and obviously, sometimes you need to go to experts, right? It's not the case that the independent person, if he's diagnosed with cancer, he's got to become an oncologist. And if his sink backs up, he's got to become a plumber, right? We're allowed, okay. Now, obviously, on some issues, there can be a great gulf between what the expert knows and has to know in order to be an expert in this particular type of brain surgery or whatever it might be, right? And what you know. So So one does have to be careful when employing others in these ways, right? You have to be especially careful there to not sacrifice your independence. I mean, one important point is simply, it is not a necessary feature. It is not a necessary, inevitable feature of consulting an expert that, you're an abject second-hander. What's crucial is what you do with what the expert says, how you treat what he says. Okay. I mean, in the first place, you should, in a first-handed way, try to ensure this is a good person to go to for some consultation about the problem with my body or my car or whatever it might be. I mean, to start, you have that responsibility in being independent. You've got to try to make sure this is a person who is worth listening to. Listening to means that, not I will obey whatever he says, okay? Then you've got to follow up when he tells you what the problem is or what he recommends you do. Great gulf in the two, in some specialized cases, there can be this great gulf in knowledge. So you ask questions. You try to understand as best you can. Any semi-rational expert will understand that you need him to break things down into a layman's terms, right? I mean, you can't understand in the depth and detail that he can, but you can ask questions, you can persist a little bit to try to understand. You can look for a second opinion. You can talk to friends who might know more in this area and so on, okay? So I think what you're raising is a good point. That is, there is a real danger, especially when we're dealing with other people, particularly when it's other people we know and respect and admire, or people who have a damn good track record, right, of allowing their thinking to substitute for our own. But that's what you cannot do. You cannot accept, to be independent, you cannot accept another person's ideas to, okay, I've got some blurry something in my head of what the right answer is here, so I'll go with that. You've got to work to try to give it genuine cognitive status in your mind, okay? Here's a related point, all right? I was rereading recently Ayn Rand's The Art of Nonfiction, and she made roughly this point about the classicists in art. She said their attitude was, somebody else understands what's good in art, so we'll just go ahead and do that. Beware that attitude, well, he understands, that's good enough, right? Beware that attitude. Now, again, this is particularly tempting with people who have a good track record that you have. I mean, maybe many times you have been first-handed in thinking through what they say, and you find you agree with your own book on this, that, or the other thing, right? But if you don't yet understand, it would not be first-handed to say, well, he knows what we're doing wrong in the Middle East, so that's good enough. That's not good enough. Okay? My God, I gave you a long answer there. And now you're going to tell me I didn't even answer the question. Is that it?
No, that was all good. But my main concern...
That's a very polite way of saying, yeah, you didn't.
I'm also interested in a slightly different angle, which is whether it's a value ever simply not even to seek the guidance or advice of others when learning from them.
It depends on why one's doing that. I mean, if you think there are a lot of things I don't consult my colleagues at the department at UT about. I think for good reason, right? But there's no point, I mean, unless you have something specific that I could hear more about in mind, there's no point in just showing I can do it alone. Now, I mean, at some point, if you're learning a certain technique, perhaps, in doing the math homework, at a certain point you want to let go of certain training wheels and do it yourself. But independence is not about trying to show something about yourself. I don't mean to read that into your question. I just have my own agenda for Q&A, so I want to just use the platform, right? So I don't mean to imply that that's what you had in mind. Mm-hmm. But, again, it's not about being different. It's not, well, that's another story. I'll get back to that if you want, but sorry. Getting closer?
Yeah, I could give you a specific example. It doesn't look like there are too many other people.
Well, we have a little time right now, it looks like. Yeah.
Say I know someone who is interested in objectivism, but is trying to limit, how much she reads of the nonfiction.
She's trying to limit how much she reads of it.
Yeah, I mean, she'll read it occasionally, but really thinks that she needs to go slowly and have the intellectual context she needs before she accepts something from the nonfiction, before she really has the means to judge it for herself. So she wants to try to recreate it as much as possible for herself without going there for the help.
Oh, without going to the nonfiction.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't think there are any general rules about that kind of thing. I mean, it sounds, if she's worried that she has dependent tendencies, whether she thinks of it in those terms or not, right? I mean, if she's worried that she might be too influenced by something, then it can be good. I mean, it sounds like in a case like that, it can be healthy to think, well, let me think this through first to see what I come to, and then let me look at that. I mean, I even try to do that sometimes. It's like, you know, I don't want to be influenced, even subconsciously, by having read his opinion or her opinion on this thing. You know, let me think about it first for myself somewhat. That can be a good thing, right? As long as it's not this policy of got to do it all for oneself. Okay?
That all clarifies it. Thanks.
Thanks.
This concept of interdependence, do you think that's a valid concept? Do you think it's a package deal of some sort, maybe even an anti-concept?
It's an ambiguous concept to begin with, right? I mean, that's one of the things I was saying. Well, we have to see what, and it is not, the meaning, the intended meaning is not typically pinned down. Sometimes it is, and it is this claim that, you know, nobody can survive without other people. And that's just false. So then it's, I mean, okay, so in that case, it is just a falsehood to say that we are all interdependent. I mean, in a sense, you know, it's a hyphenated concept. And this idea, right? I mean, it's, and there's nothing wrong per se with all hyphenated concepts, right? But they take the concept of dependence, which means cannot exist without this other thing. And then they say, I cannot exist without you, and you cannot exist without me. Not so. Okay. But again, for starters, it's usually used in a murky way, and that's part of what it trades on to gain credence. I don't have a better analysis. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the ongoing argument over whether Peter Keating is an altruist? And would you care to take a stand on that subject?
I'm not deeply familiar with it. I read a little of the HBL exchange, which I think was about a year ago, okay? And I didn't read it all or follow it closely. He's certainly not an altruist by intention or by design. He is not, I will say this, I do not think he is in any genuine, valid sense a selfish person. He may intend to serve himself. He doesn't have a clue of what a self is, and he doesn't have a self. I mean, one of the things I meant to be saying in this talk was I think he starts betraying himself from an early age and just keeps going such that there is nothing left. And you cannot serve yourself if you do not have a self, and that's what he surrenders, you know, more and more and more as the book goes on.
Isn't there a sense in which it is true that our survival is dependent on others, namely on the others that are the creative geniuses throughout history? Without those, we'd be still struggling in the cave.
Okay, I think, though, it is not the nature of man that no individual man can exist but for the existence of some other better, smarter, more productive men. It is true as a matter of historical fact that all sorts of lesser individuals, not necessarily morally lesser, but less able or less intelligent or whatever, have benefited tremendously from the more productive or able, or in some cases more virtuous, okay? But to benefit is not necessarily to be dependent. If you, and I mean, I think Dr. Peikoff gives some example to this effect, you know, if you do what you can to be productive to earn your way, such that you pay for the quart of milk at the corner or the car that you buy and so on, right? You're not just saying, give me a handout or whatever. You're not bringing as much to the table as the Hank Rearden, perhaps, right? But you are, you are making your own way and can find others to voluntarily trade with you. You are not in the same league as a dependent person. Okay. I'm sorry, I mixed up the alternation there. Yes?
I've got a question about maybe the division of labor in this issue. When you're raised in an irrational culture, you probably accept thousands and thousands of bad ideas growing up, not even realizing it. And even though you think independently, you know, for every 10 you catch, there's 100 others that get by you for quite a while. And until you read something in OPAR or through experience of life, it can take a long time to sort all those out. And to what extent should a person feel guilty for not having spotted all these bad ideas?
You should feel very guilty. You shouldn't feel guilty for what you genuinely did not notice through no evasion on your part. I think what you say now, I'm not quite sure on the connection with the division of labor economy, but just
well, I mean, you know, just the stuff that's in the culture, like how to educate your kids.
On that, I'm with you completely.
How to do this, how to do that.
Oh, no. I'm with you completely in that it is so prevalent in so many different forms. We are so saturated in this idea that it is right to defer to others, that even after you've cleaned up your act, rejected Catholicism in my case, right? Rejected a lot of the values of my family and so on, I still find shards of it frequently.
Yeah.
And I think it's very natural to have absorbed elements of it without realizing it.
Yeah,
you do need to be on the lookout so that you can catch it. And that means you need to honestly be on the lookout, be introspective. What was motivating me there? What was motivating me there? And you might catch some unflattering things. It's like, ooh, that was kind of second-handed, Tara. Yeah. But so I don't think there's any reason to feel guilt about what you did not evade. You know, if you genuinely didn't know, and you can't solve yourself or correct all your problems overnight. I mean, just to go to the other extreme, right? You certainly can't. You know, you read Atlas, you read Fountainhead, you reject certain beliefs, voila, you're whole. And you're practicing all of the virtues 100%. I don't think it happens that way for anyone, okay? You've got, and I'll tell you, I mean, in my case, this is not one of the virtues that came more naturally or is coming more naturally to me. This isn't. This is one of the ones I realized several years ago, ooh, you got a lot of second-handedness messing things up. So, I mean, this is one of the ones for me that I've had to make a very deliberate, systematic, conscious effort to work on understanding more fully and catching myself at more fully. But I don't feel guilty. I mean, I feel badly about it, but not in the sense of guilt or responsibility. When you evade, though, when you're getting the evidence that there's something dubious about your motivation there, you got to follow up. And in this vein, let me make another related point. A lot of independence, of being independent, I think, is about being honest with yourself. And again, you may not always like what you find. Recently I had a conversation with someone about this a little bit, and they reminded me of, I think, a good image, which for me now will sort of, I don't know, be helpful in a way. It's the image that Dr. Peikoff talks about in, I think it was not Ayn Rand, A Sense of Life, but you know there was an interview with him a few years ago, more recently, some of you may have seen it, and he's talking about some reminiscences of his experience with Ayn Rand. At any rate, you may have heard this story. He talks about how many evenings he'd be over at Ayn Rand's apartment talking for hours, it's late at night or early in the morning, and he's at the elevator. So this is the elevator image in my mind. He's at the elevator, and the elevator's come, he's got one foot in the door, and she's down the hall saying, okay, good night, Leonard. He's like, but you know, I do still have one question about that one thing. That's great. Now, not necessarily at 2 a.m. or across the hall and so on, but whether it's expressed to others or expressed to oneself, it's realizing, you know, I do still have a question about that. Or I'm not quite sure about this part of what ARI is saying the right policy is on such and such, right? Or that thing, right? It's whenever you have those little doubts, those little hesitations, those little I'm not quite sure, you have to pursue them. Not necessarily then and there, but you have to be honest with yourself about what you see for yourself based on reality, based on the relevant evidence, and what you don't. And not, oh yeah, I think that too. Well, no, I don't really get that yet, so I can't say I'm committed to that yet. So I do think honesty is a very important part of being, honesty with oneself, a very important part of being independent properly. Yes?
Well, I just wonder if maybe this attempt to be independent would explain how some people are looking for little tiny flaws in someone else to criticize.
I'm sorry, looking for?
tiny flaws to criticize as though that indicated independence, whereas the independence would actually be acknowledging the time that these people saved us in not having to figure every single thing from the first step, but we have to validate it as far as we can. We may not be scientists or something like that, but we have to say, okay, this seems reasonable as far as I can judge it. And where I can't judge it, I have to say I don't know. But we have to acknowledge that the payment is not just that we have a job. The payment is in the acknowledgement.
The payment is in?
The acknowledgement.
Oh.
Yeah. And not this pseudo-independence
Yes.
of looking
No,
for
pseudo is the
someone
next
small.
word coming out. There's all sorts of pseudo, I mean, we do have lots of pseudo-independence in our culture. Assertions of independence, for the most part, of being different, wearing the nose rings or whatever it might be, or the purple hair, or being the person who, oh, I get everything, I agree with everything in Ayn Rand, but you know that one thing, just for the sake of having that one thing, right? Now, there's a difference if you really don't get something, or you really have thought about it 1,000, right? I mean, that's fine. You know, an honest disagreement is different from these people who I think you raised at the beginning of your question. You know, you raised it quite rightly. You know, these people who just make it a point to show their distinctive signature, you know, but I'm still Tara, so I have to disagree with something. I have to show I'm different to show that I'm independent. Independence, I think I started saying this earlier, it isn't about showing anything about yourself, anything else, anybody else. It's about being anchored to what's the relevant evidence here. And you're quite right that when you see the evidence of some people having done Herculean things, tremendous achievements, and so on, the rational response is, God bless you, the rational response is, good for you, thank you, I have benefited, right? And I mean, the virtue of justice is largely about this, of paying tribute to the so many people who have done great work, yeah. But you do have to be aware of pseudo-independence for sure, because there's a lot of that afoot. Yes.
Thank you. Do you have any specific advice for college students on this, college and graduate students? Now, I'm not thinking of the professor who demands that you spit back his views, because that's relatively easy. You just sit down and do it and move on. But the professor who wants you to demonstrate some thinking, but to show it to him by reams of scholarship that you've read, where a student is forced to read reams of irrelevant scholarship and to demonstrate it in bibliographies, which can be very seductive, you know.
I'm not quite sure, though, on the two parts. I mean, the spit it back, is that separate from the second point about the research?
I'm submitting, and you could comment that that's relatively easy.
Yeah.
Figure out what he wants and just write it down. Right. But there's a methodological issue that's more insidious, I think, that demands that a student read reams and reams and reams of irrelevant scholarship,
so that he can
cited in
spit back
bibliographies
right.
and in footnotes. Do you have any advice on? Yeah, that's.
I mean, that is a situation, right? I mean, if it's the case, and if you have good reason, I mean, I'm sure some of you have heard other objectivist scholars talk about this before, right? If it's the case that you, the student, have good reason to think you will be penalized for not doing things a certain way, whether it's simply saying certain things on your exams or showing that you've read the junk, if it's the case that it is junk, right? You know, if you have good reason to think I will be unfairly penalized for not doing it this way, he's the guy who holds power. You should do it. You should be as aware as you can be when you are not proceeding by rational methods, that is what you are doing. I mean, this is certainly advice we often give to OAC-trained students, right? You know, once you've got to act on the wrong premises of irrational academics, and they're not all irrational, okay? And that's another point we might say something about. But when you are compelled by their power over you in an educational setting to do that, you need to be very conscious of what you're doing and very conscious of what the proper way of doing it would be, so as to try to keep from being infected by this. But I don't think there's any moral sin in doing it. If you're legitimately at this place, you didn't really have options of going to schools with better, more rational or honest or open faculty, right, to get your degree. Okay.
But see, the deeper issue I'm asking, maybe this is not an issue, is that a graduate student who's writing a dissertation is forced to read reams and reams and reams of scholarship in order to demonstrate knowledge of it. And do you think that has any effect on a person's ability to be independent? Is there an issue there with avoiding that?
I I don't think so. Maybe I'm missing something or just not thinking of.
Yeah,
I'm open to argument on that, but I don't think so. One can read a great deal and become learned in an area while being critical throughout. Now, obviously, the more educated and trained you are, you may be in a much better position to be critical if you've done it for 5 years or 10 years. Somebody with 20 years experience than the new graduate student, right? But you can read critically. For heaven's sake, students in Lisa Van Dam's academy are reading critically, it sounds like, right? I mean, people can start reading critically at an early age, and you always have to, maintain that when you read anything.
We're out of time.
Oh, we're out of time. Sorry. Okay.